We promised you exclusive details of what's in the Government of India's draft e-commerce policy, and here it goes. The draft e-commerce policy talks about having a holistic policy for this burgeoning space, a holistic policy which will try and look at all aspects. Now, for a long time, we've been wondering, will there be a regulator when it comes to e-commerce companies? What the government now seems to be proposing is, and how it will monitor e-commerce companies is this way. All e-commerce players will have to register with a competent authority as identified with the Government of India. The government shall collect information from e-commerce platforms to aid its own decision making. So who's going to do the actual monitoring? Well, it seems like it's going to be a standing group of secretaries that will be from time to time giving recommendations when it comes to policy making and e-commerce platforms. And they will also play an important role in the administration of the e-commerce policy. So that is how e-commerce players, domestic as well as global, small or large, will be monitored. Now, one of the regulatory challenges that has been identified with the government is to have a level playing field, where it talks about how e-commerce can sometimes lead to one or two dominant players, and it wants to bust that, wants to bust any kind of a monopoly that might actually exist. And for that, it's looking to create a mechanism to holistically inquire into violation of laws. So the government will be empowered, it seems, to create a mechanism, and from time to time it can see if any laws are being violated and decide on action thereafter. It goes on to say in the draft policy that there is a tendency for one or two strong companies to exercise control over a repository of data that's collected, and the entity that has the maximum information about a market can dominate it, and that can subvert competition. Now, the next crucial part, the handling of data. What we are being told is that the draft e-commerce policy proposes that cross-border flow of data of Indians and their transactions should not be permitted. So A, no cross-border flow of data. Second, and this is an important one, an Indian firm will have to audit an e-commerce company's data. An educated guess, but this one could turn out to be a very contentious clause. Inclusive growth, that's something else the e-commerce policy is talking about, and to do so, it wants to streamline regulatory processes to ease compliance burden. Now, here also where it gets very interesting. The government wants all state emporiums to go online, to have e-emporiums, but it's also talking about the government's own e-marketplace, GEM as it's called, the long-driven mission being that it shouldn't just be for the government, but it should be for you and me, it should be for ordinary consumers in India. The draft is not going to detail, so I'll leave it for you to think about it, whether the government wants to have an e-commerce platform. Enhancing expos, this is something the government is very committed to. So it wants to digitally integrate multiple interfaces, or whether it's the CBIC or the GSTN, the DGFT, and also wants to bring the exporters of e-commerce exports at par with offline exporters. And the idea, therefore, being to also digitize GST refunds and all of that, and also give drawback duties online. As far as fair competition goes, the e-commerce companies must have an algorithm that does not make any bias. All sellers and vendors must be treated equally, and there must be a clear and discounted policy. As far as anti-counterfeit and anti-piracy goes, the draft policy suggests that the e-commerce platform will be jointly liable for counterfeit items being sold on the platform. So a lot to be talked about, and let me invite our guest today. We're being joined by Siddharth Pai, as well as he's of course going to give us the investor's perspective and the starter's perspective. For the legal perspective, we're going to lean on Vaibhav Kakkar. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Startup Central. Siddharth Pai, let me come to you first. Now, this is a space with very little governance, has completely exploded. We all know, for example, how the government had certain reservations when it came to e-pharmacies. Coronavirus changed that. So my first question to you is, why rock a boat, a well-functioning, healthy boat which is out in the ocean?
Rather, if you actually plotted the growth of any category which startups actually dominate, what we always see is startups usually proliferate in an area where there aren't too many regulations, and the moment the area actually becomes large enough, that at that point in time the government actually steps in, and then the moat or the cost to entry becomes so high for anyone who actually comes in, it becomes sort of regulatory moat and regulatory barrier that's actually been created. And e-commerce, mind you, if you look at since 2010 all the way to 2020, e-commerce has actually garnered the largest amount of capital because the rules were actually extremely simple. and the rules were lax, and the cost to actually create a startup in that particular area was extremely simple. It all depended on the customers and ability to actually satisfy the customer's need when it actually came to it. So as of now, for anyone looking to start up an e-commerce policy I would say this is the 8th or 9th change over the past 18 to 24 months. When it actually comes to the e-commerce policy itself, it makes it impossible for any normal entrepreneur to actually start up any operation in this as of now. I think what the government should really do and what investors are actually hoping for is that this actually becomes the last e-commerce policy change that actually comes up for a little while longer. So the entire industry has some amount of time to actually take a step back, take cognizance of all the changes that have happened, and then decide what the path forward. Because as of now, the cost of operations for these marketplaces alone is becoming so high because the compliance cost is constantly increasing. The audit of data by various Indian firms being liable for any counterfeit products, in spite of actually running a marketplace in that regard, being made to adhere to the DEPA regulations, which I hope Vaibhav will actually speak about, without the DEPA actually becoming an act. All these are essentially confusing the entire industry to a large extent. And I would say the entry of a government player also into this is actually causing a lot of flutters from anyone. Because we've seen the moment the government becomes the umpire, regulator, as well as a player and participant in any industry, that industry usually starts seeing very, very strong headwinds in that particular regard. So I think it's a wait and watch. It's wait and watch on the investor side as of now. I'm very confident when the e-commerce policies come out, the investors as well as the startup industry will have a number of comments that hopefully the government will actually address in time to make sure there is some sort of stability in regulations, and through that stability in turn actually attracts entrepreneurship as well as attracts capital to these particular sectors.
Of course, the one space in the startup universe which has attracted the most amount of capital for very obvious reasons. We saw India following that Me Too model. Then look at the kind of exits the Flipkart founders got. All of that. Vaibhav Kakkar, if I can come to you. You know, industry doesn't like anything which is not absolutely clear. And e-commerce is a space which has seen a whole host of changes, right? It happened soon after Walmart bought Flipkart as well. So same question I want to ask you first. Considering that e-commerce will also fall for obvious reasons under so many different ministries, whether it's information technology, whether it's also consumer and all of that, do we need one more policy? Or it's actually essential simply because there are so many ministries that are involved?
Hi, Nayantara. Good evening. And it's a very fair question you ask. I would also tend to agree with the sentiment that Siddharth expressed. When I went through this version of the draft policy, it sort of came to me that, what are we trying to achieve here? If you actually look at the e-commerce sector, and there is, of course, a strong notion in mind of us all that it is fairly unregulated. It is a fact that it's fairly unregulated. But if you start looking at number of sectoral regulators that are already assuming relevance when it comes to the e-commerce sector, it will be pretty surprising to note that you're talking about almost 7-8 different ministries already involved. So you have FDI policy and a specific guidelines for FDI coming into e-commerce. So that's where the DPIT comes in. You have the Competition Commission of India, which steps in each time there's allegation of abuse of dominance. And we are seeing a number of cases against e-commerce majors, which are playing out before the CCI. So you've seen a number of complaints against Amazon, Flipkart, and the likes. Then you have the IT ministry, and you have the IT rules and the intermediary guidelines, which are administered by them, which talk of the safe harbor protection for e-commerce operators. So you have these 3 framework of guidelines. You have recently seen the Ministry of Consumer Affairs notify the e-consumer guidelines for e-commerce and sale of goods and services through e-commerce medium. So you already have 4-5 frameworks. You already have the privacy bill, which I think should see the light at the end of the tunnel by the end of this year, which does talk about data localization. You already have RBI guidelines under the Payment and Settlement Systems Act for online payments. So you already have number of statutes that are regulating different aspects of e-commerce business already. Now, in that backdrop, when I went through the draft policy at some place talks about registration of these e-commerce companies with a particular ministry or a nodal wing. And then it also talks about the fact that that nodal wing will have the ability to ask for information as it deems appropriate. I think those are angles, if you were to ask any entrepreneur, and as somebody who's helped a number of entrepreneurs go through that growth phase in the e-commerce side, I think those are nuances which, over a period of time start showing its venom. And I think while I completely laud the government for its initiative to streamline and give as much focus and impetus to e-commerce as they can, but I'm not so sure if that intent has followed through in the letter of the draft policy that at least I have reviewed, where, when you're talking of registration, you're giving regulators the ability to access information. Suddenly you're talking about it not being such a good thing for one or two players to be dominant. I thought the benchmark is abuse of dominance and not really dominance. That is what the law provides for. And again, the whole concept of symmetrical treatment to different sellers is a very, very specific animal, Nayantara, in the backdrop of FDI rules. And some people having tried to abuse the FDI rules on e-commerce marketplace. And therefore they said, please treat, if you want to call yourself a genuine marketplace, please treat all your sellers at same parity. But this is, mind you, going to be an e-commerce policy notified by a certain ministry, applicable to all e-commerce operators, irrespective of domestic or foreign capital. In fact, the policy says so. So I wonder what is the intent and what is the motivation to have a domestic e-commerce operator being told to be fair with every seller. And because ultimately, where does your USP come? Where is the price differentiation? If everybody is going to be symmetrical in their treatment, where will you bring innovation? So I think those are also very important questions to think about.
Okay, we're running out of time. In fact, we've got less than 2 minutes before we go into commercial breaks. So that I'll give you the final comment, and one that I think will really blow up, and which is that the government is of the view that cross-border data flow should not take place, and there should be an Indian firm that will do a data audit. An e-commerce company's biggest asset is the data it collects and it mines. How do you see this playing out?
I think it's to actually borrow from what Vaibhav said, it's good intentions, but I don't think the intentions have actually translated to policy. It's not the job of the e-commerce policy to actually speak about data protection. That's why the DEP has come out, has gone through various, the Sri Krishna committee has already given its report, the public comments have already gone in. I think it's a job of that to actually comment. Because the moment the government now starts actually striking at the very core of various enterprises, if it's e-commerce today, next year it may actually become hyper-local, after that it may become cloud, it may become SaaS. We're essentially reverting back to where we were pre-liberalization as well, where essentially it becomes a sort of inspection Raj or a license Raj is actually coming in place. I think the job of the government is to actually state what the rules of the playground are, and then to actually let market forces actually come to place over there. Make sure there's transparency that comes in as opposed to mandating these sort of items. I think the moment that happens and that clarity comes in, what we're seeing with e-commerce as of now is actually the very tip of the iceberg. What COVID has done is accelerated the adoption of e-commerce across not just buying goods, not just buying like phones or fashion or something, but to every single aspect of commercial transactions around. And the widespread repercussions of this, once the policy comes out, is hopefully something that the industry can actually impress upon the government. And the government, this is being a listening government, as the finance minister said multiple times, listens to everyone's concerns and to actually create a free and fair policy for any of the players as well as the consumers in the e-commerce space itself. That's our hope in this regard.
Okay, gentlemen, we're completely pressed for time. But the other part which I found very interesting was the government's long endeavor to convert its own e-marketplace into one where consumers, you and me, normal people, can actually go buy. That right now is only for state and government departments. A government that says that it has no business being in business, looking at a new business, I don't know. I guess only time will tell. We'll take a short commercial break. Siddharth and Vaibhav, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for joining us today on Startup Central.